You're all getting psyched right now for this. In a world dominated by one language on the web, chaos runs amok. JavaScript selectors litter the DOM, and with no code readability, humanity's last hope lies in frameworks that can best handle the beast of the web page. In a few moments, one framework, against all odds, will battle the complexity and restore the sanity of web development. The trials will be great. The obstacles will be seemingly unsurpassable. But despite all adversity, this framework must succeed because it is the only thing between us and a lack of code readability that plagues standard JavaScript development. This moment, coming to your computer, this is the React tutorial. So, hi everyone, I'm Jackson. This is my first feature-length presentation. Yeah, so gonna put on all the stuff for this. So, we are today learning about React, which is a JavaScript framework that really helps you do a lot of complex things on the front end. So, first a bit about React. React was developed by Facebook. And of course, if you have seen one of my presentations before, we will have the mandatory call to beat Mark Zuckerberg. That's what we're all here for. We're going to build the next website that beats Facebook. But we'll use React to do it. Beat Facebook with its own medicine. So, a bit more about React. What is it and what isn't it? So, if you are all familiar with the sort of model view controller type design pattern, the view is the thing that actually shows things to people. The model stores all the data, and then logic or the controller is the thing that handles all that. So what is React and what isn't React? Well, React does not contain the model. It does not contain the logic. It's just the view. So you can just think of React as a very simple way to handle the way that you display information on your web page. And this is beneficial because when you have something that's just the view, you can integrate with so many other frameworks. These are just a small selection of some of the frameworks built for the full stack in React. So these frameworks use React as the view and then use other kinds of methods for the model and the controller. Before we go on, I'd like to say React is insanely beautiful. It is what I consider to be the best of the front-end development type things for JavaScript. There are really only three things that you need to keep in mind when you're working with React. The first one is that everything is something called a component. Components are, you can think of them as little divisions of your web page, and each component handles its own thing. The second, components can be nested. Components can be inside of each other. So you can have a parent component and then a child component. You should be familiar with the nesting from all of your HTML development because, of course, that has a lot of nesting in it when you nest something inside of a div or inside of a span. The third thing is that components have functions that will trigger on certain events. So there are various functions that are a part of React that will happen and be triggered and give you the proper information to handle a certain event. So if you were all here for the jQuery thing, you had to build your own event listeners and listen for certain kinds of things. React does a lot of that for you right now. So without further ado, I don't want to keep you isolated from React right now. So I want you all to follow along with me. Go to this URL and I want you to put your thumbs up on the desk when you're done. So we're going to make sure that all of you understand how to build a React application before we're done here. So just put your thumbs up on the desk when you're at this site, and we can go through it. So this goes to a JSFiddle site. It's basically Plunker, except I just chose JSFiddle because Facebook developed a sort of framework that integrates directly with JSFiddle, so it's kind of easier to do React development on it. It's basically the same thing as Plunker, though. So everyone there? Awesome. Let's get started with our first page. Okay, mandatory lens flare per each page might be a bit too much. We'll just kind of make that lens flare a bit smaller. So this is what you should be seeing right now. And let's walk through this code a bit. So we can see that there are two portions. We have our script and our actual HTML here. Now keep in mind, usually when you're doing React development, most of your development is going, and most of your HTML is going to be inside of a React component. So this stuff right here is actually all we're going to do. You don't even need to touch this HTML portion because we're all going to do all of our work inside the JavaScript portion. But let's walk through it just for understanding a bit. First of all, we include a Facebook library for React. And you can see that this library is specially designed to work with JSFiddle. That's okay. All of this is for educational purposes. None of this would actually go into production. If you want to learn how to put something into production, I have a tutorial on my website about how to use the Flexible framework, which works with React. But more on that eventually. So we also have an outlining div with an ID container. Here is where we actually create our React class. And in this, we have a function. So a class is created off of this default function that's a part of React. And this function accepts an object as a parameter. And these this object contains keys, or a list of various functions that React can use. One of those functions is the render function. And the render function is where you're going to tell this component how it's going to render HTML. So we can see here that we have a render function that returns this HTML here, div hello this.props.name. I'll go into what this.props.name is eventually, but not right now. And then finally at the bottom, we have a render function. And this render function will say, will take in the HTML component, which is hello, saved here, but then written as an HTML component, as well as the actual HTML component in the web page that you want React to inject it into. So you can see here that we are injecting it into document.getElementById container. We're all familiar with document.getElementById, right? It takes in an actual element. So that's going to inject this into the container. And if you're looking on your screen, you can see that's in fact what it does. It actually renders that component. So let's go on. Let's do something a bit more complicated. Actually, I think that this is what you're seeing in your page, right? No? You saw what was there before? Okay. Go ahead and, just for the purpose of everything, kind of delete that props setting, this props.name here, and change it over to this. I kind of formatted it a bit different here because I just like the way that looks. So go ahead and change it over to this format. Put your thumbs up when you're done. Also, you can see in the previous format, there were no parentheses surrounding the HTML. That's because when it's one line, you can just return it. But if it's multiple lines, you need to include these parentheses surrounding HTML. And I just prefer to include the parentheses all the time, just as a personal thing, but you don't necessarily have to get it to run. So while you're doing that, I'm going to note one other thing. This right here doesn't actually work in the web browser. This is using a framework called JSX. And JSX, before it will actually display on the web page, it will compile everything. So it will scan through this HTML and convert it to actual JavaScript that actually works in the browser. But if we're using JSX, we can use the HTML all day long. So that's awesome. All right, everyone good? Everyone modified it all? Cool. Let's get into something a bit more complicated and build some dynamic parts onto our component. So you can see I've highlighted the things that I've changed here in the render function. Keep in mind, the render function is just a regular function. It doesn't need to just include HTML. So you can see here, just like any other function, I can define a variable in it. Here I'm defining a variable called random. It's taking in a random number. And so I can put anything I want in this function as long as it's not inside of this return JSX element. Also, I am creating a new paragraph that uses this dynamic content. So React wants, and JSX uses a bracket in order to say, this is where I want to put dynamic content. Don't actually print this onto the screen. Don't actually print random times 100 onto the screen. Print what the value of that would be. So you can see I say, here's random times 100 and 46.45 because that's, on that time I ran it, it happened to be that number. So this is dynamic content. If you keep refreshing it, if you keep running it, everyone's able to run it all right? Everyone's good? Awesome. So you can all see that, right? Put your thumbs up if you can see that. And if you have any trouble throughout this tutorial, anything at all, anything, I don't want you to get stuck, I'd like you to raise your hand and tell me if there's any trouble that you're having. Awesome. Fantastic. So that's dynamic content. Let's get a bit more complicated. So remember, what were some of the three things that I said you need to know for React? Okay. Yeah? Everything's a component. Yeah, components can be nested. That's what we're going to talk about next. Let's create a nested component. So here we have created a new component above our old component. And this is important because when you are defining that component, it needs to be defined before you actually use it. So this nested component will be inside of our parent component. So this nested component contains a render function, and it contains a render function, and it returns just a span saying, I like this component. Pretty easy. And then the thing to note is down here, we are including in JSX our nested component. And one thing that's very important to note, because I ran into this a few problems like this as well, if it's a component, the variable always must start with an uppercase letter. If it does not start with an uppercase letter, you can't include it in JSX like this. The JSX parser has a problem. So nested component has an uppercase letter, and we are putting it inside of this. And you can see that when you run it, it just will show up. And this is within that component. And you can see that it's there, and we don't have any CSS styling it, but trust, it is actually inside of the div that makes up this component. So that's pretty awesome. You can imagine a lot of things you can do with a website from this. You could imagine that you have a full website page with a header and then a content component. And then you can put different components inside of that content. And then you might have a navigation component and a widget component. Just so many things in here. The fact that everything is made up of components makes things so simple in React. All right, everyone good? Everyone have that? Fantastic. Cool. So now let's talk about something new. let's talk about the concept of state and props. Now, I know that I said that React doesn't have a model, React doesn't have something that stores data, and that's relatively true from an architecture standpoint, but even in a view, a lot of times you do need data for things that aren't necessarily related to the logic of the app, and it's just about the actual way things are displayed. So state and props are the two ways that you can store and transfer data. Let's take a look at that in action. So let's first work with props. So props is something that gets transferred as an attribute to this component here. So I've added two new props to our component called has and random. If this looks familiar to anyone, this is exactly how you put attributes in components in tags for HTML. But now we get to come up with our own tags, which is awesome. So in this tag, I'm inserting a string called cookies, and in this tag, I'm inserting a variable. Remember, the brackets is how you put in dynamic content. So I insert the variable random. And as you can see here, using this dynamic content, we can access these props by running this.props.random. So this is just an object. It contains anything you want. And this.props.has. If I were to put an attribute here called Billy, then I could access it through this.props.billy. So that's an awesome way that you can transfer this content into a nested component. So, any questions? Everyone got that? Everyone good? Everyone written that up? Awesome. Cool. Now let's take a look at state. State gets a bit more complex because state isn't just about transferring things between components. State is exactly what it is. So each component can have a state, and that state can change throughout the component lifecycle. So in this one, does anyone remember what the third thing you need to remember when working with React is? It's that components have various functions that trigger on certain events. So one of the first functions that triggers is this function called getInitialState. And what this function does is it defines pretty much a default, the first thing that the state will get. So in this one, I'm defining that there is a variable in my state called number, and I'm assigning 0 to it. We're going to ignore this function right now, and we're going to go on down here to talk about these paragraphs. So just like I can access props by running this.props, I can access state by running this.state. So I'm accessing the number by saying this.state.number. And if you load this code, it will start out at 0. So I'm also including this other tag. It's a button tag, just a standard HTML button tag. And it has an attribute called onClick. And this onClick attribute contains some more dynamic content. Guess what? Dynamic content doesn't have to be a variable, it doesn't have to be a string or a number or an object. It can also be a function. In JavaScript, functions are also considered variables. So here we are inserting the function this.incrementNumber, which we've defined up here. And as we can see, because it's in the object, it is in the proper scope, so we can access it by running this. So this.incrementNumber, onClick, will call this function. And what this function does is it uses the setState function, the setState method. This setState method is used to change the state. Now, technically, you can change the state by running this.state is equal to whatever you want, but never do that. There is really almost no time that you should be directly changing state or props. You should never say this.state is equal to variable or this.props is equal to variable. Yeah?
Why?
Okay, I'll get into that. So when I update props or when I update state, usually what it means is I want it to automatically show on the page that the state is now updated. In this example, I have this number that I want to increment. If I were to if I were to just say this dot state is equal to this dot state dot number plus 1, then this wouldn't update here. It would stay at 0. But because I used set state, what set state does is a bunch of things. It sets the new state, but it also calls the render function again. So when I set the state, the render function will execute again, and this number will update. So if you have all of your code worked out, when you click it, it will keep adding more to it. And that's why you would always use set state, because it runs the render function again, and it actually updates your code. So you can already see that React components are extremely powerful and actually so much easier to use than having to constantly use jQuery to select an element and then changing that element and writing your own functions, because we have these kinds of things. Now, okay, yeah, go ahead.
Every component has a state property just by default.
Yes.
And that's like where you store variables.
Mm-hmm. So every component has a state property. Every component has a prop property.
So
Yeah.
when you set state, you're going to reload the whole page.
Yes. No, it doesn't reload the whole page, which is what's awesome about React. React knows where its components are. So it will only reload that component. It doesn't have to do anything else for any of the other components on the page. That's one of the things that makes React so efficient. React is one of the most efficient JavaScript frameworks because it uses a concept called the virtual DOM, and which renders things in JavaScript. I'm not going to go into necessarily how it works, but it is just one of the most efficient on your browser frameworks. Cool. So does everyone have that thing where you are now able to click the button and increment the number? Everyone good? If anyone is lost at all, I don't want you to stop doing the tutorial. I'd like you to keep going. Yeah?
Difference between props and state?
Awesome. So state is more bound to the React component. This says this is the information that talks about this component. It's the state of the component. Just like the state of the union talks about what kind of, what sort of position the United States is in. This component, the state of the component is what kind of position is this component in? Is our variable 0? Is our variable 34? Props is asking what kind of information is my parent component passing to me? So when you transfer the information in as a property to this, then it will automatically go to props in the component. So yeah, that's about the parent, what the parent element is transferring. State is specifically about what the current actual state of the component is. Did that answer it well?
Yeah, seems like one is more like temporal for just passing one piece of information, one is for more storage.
Yeah, perfect, cool, yeah.
Sorry, just like a little comparison. So like get initial state, that will always run like right away. So is it like
Right away.
considered like an constructor almost?
You can kind of consider that a constructor. There are other things. So get initial state must return a state. So it's not necessarily the best place to put everything you want to run at the creation of the component. And I'll go into the various places you should put things. You can kind of think of it as a structure and initializer for all of these variables. So yeah, that is somewhat of an apt comparison. One other thing that I want to mention is getInitialState is a function that is specifically a part of React. You can't pretend that getInitialState is your own function that you've just come up with. This will always trigger when the component is created. However, incrementNumber is a function I came up with. There's no such thing as incrementNumber inside React, so I can put my own functions in here as well and access them through this .incrementNumber. Awesome. Everyone good? Fantastic. Cool. Let's talk about something else. So I mentioned that there are there are a bunch of functions that trigger on certain events. Let's go through them. These are called the component specs and lifecycle. So there are 3 possible events that can happen to a component. 1, its initial mounting. That component gets loaded for the first time ever. 2, it updates. Something's changed in either state or props or something else that causes this component to update the way it's looking. And then 3rd is unmounting. That component is now getting deleted by something. It's no longer there. So let's talk about the initial mount first. And we're going to go through these functions in order of the way they execute. The very first thing that executes on the initial mount is a function called getDefaultProps. GetDefaultProps is where you define, here are the default props. If an attribute in the actual, in the parent component has not been defined, then you're going to define, here's what that attribute should be if it's been null and passed in. So that's a very useful one so that you don't have like null stuff pointing to, and your program starts crashing because it has a null pointer exception. Then, after getInitialProps, our good friend getInitialState. Basically getInitialProps, but for state. Except because the parent level component doesn't pass in any props, getInitialState needs to be called for if you have anything in state. It needs an initial state. The next thing that gets called is and just to note, this one, both getInitialProps and getInitialState must return a JSON object. Is everyone familiar with a JSON object? Raise your hand if the term JSON is new to you. Okay. Let me just, actually in that case, let me do something. Let me talk to you a bit about a JSON object. So JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And JavaScript Object Notation pretty much just defines, we are going to create a way to represent data in a string. So how are we going to represent an object? Something as complex as, like, let's say a Java, like if you think of a Java object and all the data that's in it, you can pretty much represent it with JSON except for the methods. Methods wouldn't be represented in JSON. So JSON is always defined by these curly brackets, unless it's an array. And I'll go into a kind of array. And then you have various keys. These keys will be, if it's a true JSON, it will be surrounded by quotes, double quotes, and then it will have a value, and it's separated by a comma. The value doesn't have to be a string, it can be a number. The value doesn't have to, so it can be a number or a string. The value could also be a array, which is represented by this kind of bracket. And this kind of bracket, you would then define an array like this. It's just another list of things. You're used to arrays from probably all of your programming classes. You can also define another object inside of it. So you can have nested objects. So this is proper JSON, but there are other forms that kind of adopt, like if you're in JavaScript, you can have sort of a cool enhanced version of JSON that you can just write straight into JavaScript to define objects. And this cool enhanced version of JSON allows you to define keys without quotes. Ooh, wow, that's an amazing feature right there, right? And it also allows you to define functions inside of it. So if we go back to our presentation, you can see that all of these things in this, everything inside of a React component is actually sort of one of these enhanced JSON objects with just a big list of functions, which is pretty awesome. So that is JSON. Let's see, is there anything else I'm forgetting about JSON? JSON is pretty much a huge standard for the web. Oftentimes when computers communicate with the server, they will return information in JSON. Yeah, pretty huge. Cool. So where was I? So yeah, these two functions must return JSON, some JSON value with a list where all the keys are the actual variables that they want in the object, and then all of the values are of course, values of that. One other thing, if you're not familiar with JSON, that I just thought of. Let's say I wanted to access this value here. Just like any Java object that you would be used to, like let's say this is var my object. Just like any one of those, I could access it just like any other object, my object dot key1, and that would print out value, the word value. Fantastic. Okay, any other questions? Awesome. Great. So, get initial state. The next thing that triggers after those two, which as you mentioned can be kind of considered like a constructor, is component will mount. This is a function that happens right before the component actually displays on the page. And you can put anything you want in here, anything that might be useful before this component displays on the page. Here I just console logged component will mount triggered because it's saying that it's been triggered, but there are a lot of useful things that you could use this for. After that, as promised, it will call the render function. And we're used to the render function before. You've already put it in your actual type up. And this render function, of course, will actually render the content. It must return either JSX, if you have a JSX parser, or the more complex version, JavaScript version that JSX compiles to. I'm not going to go over that in the presentation because JSX is it's really good to use JSX. I use JSX for everything just because it's so much simpler to actually type out the HTML instead of the really long string of JavaScript commands it takes to just render an HTML element. So after the render, the final thing that gets called is component did mount. This call gets called right after the render function. It's like component will mount, except it gets called after it. So put any code here that might be useful after the component does its initial render. Cool. Any questions? And this is it for the initial mount. Any questions about the initial mount? Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question about the JSON.
Yeah, go.
That was just like when you write an object in JavaScript.
Yeah, so JavaScript uses JSON for its objects.
What's the point of differentiating that this is how we write it, it's called JSON? Like, if I'm writing an object in just Java, we don't call it like JSON. Like, well, what is JSON?
So, okay, a JavaScript object it's more complex than JSON. You're able to put functions in it. So I call it enhanced JSON because it's written like a JSON format, but you have enhancements on it. JSON itself is just a string. It can be stored as a string. The reason why I kind of bring it up is just so that you kind of know the format for JSON. Knowing that in web development, knowing the format for JSON will be extremely useful in the future when you're working with holding data and transferring it between client and server, because a lot of HTTP requests, some of the most common types to return as an HTTP request is HTML, which is just the standard web page, and JSON, which is this kind of notation. I'm not going to, there's a few other ones that are pretty popular, but I'm not going to go into them just because I don't want to distract. But yeah, it's just a standard. Did that kind of answer it? Okay, fantastic. Any other questions?
Does
Yes.
the order within the component need to match the life cycle that you just put up, or could I call render before get initial state?
You could, yes. Now, that will work because in a object, in a JSON object, these keys, the order doesn't matter what key it is in. I can still, if I were to move key 1 up here or up here, I could still call my object.key1 and it would all work. Same thing in React. There are style guides for React, though, that say that you should do that because it just increases code readability. The render, usually, it's not necessarily in that order. It's that order, but render is always last. Usually that's the style guide for React. But it can work without that. It's just for people who are sticklers for coding style, that's the way it works. Fantastic.
So in React, you write both, or some JavaScript and some HTML. So how do you comment?
Commenting. Okay, so commenting in JSX is somewhat difficult. Let me bring up this JS fiddle and kind of show you how I would comment.
I don't know if you use the HTML way to
Yeah.
comment it or.
Exactly. So the short answer is the HTML way doesn't work. The JSX compiler falls down on itself. If I wanted to comment something just outside of this return, then I could just use regular JavaScript. But inside of this return, we have a problem in terms of commenting. Like, let's say I wanted to comment out this nested thing. The regular HTML way of commenting, that doesn't work. It throws an error. So the best way I've found to do it, and this is kind of tedious, but if you do want to comment it, you would first turn this thing into dynamic content, then comment out that dynamic content, because anything inside dynamic content works like JavaScript. So you can comment out that dynamic content. And I know that putting those brackets and then putting those parentheses with asterisks around it are kind of annoying, but that's the best way that I've found to do it.
Okay. Thank you.
Cool. All right, so anything else? Awesome. Let's talk about all of the things that could be triggered for updating. So yeah, let's start with the first one that gets triggered. Component will receive props. This is what happens when the props changes. So this will get triggered whenever the parent component has changed what's getting injected into props. Now, the name of component will receive props is somewhat misleading because it will, because this thing will not trigger on the initial load. So you can think of components receiving props on the initial load because the parent is giving it props, but it doesn't trigger. So just keep that in mind if you're wondering why isn't my function triggering when when I'm initially giving my component props. Just doesn't trigger, it only triggers on updating. Awesome. So this is something, it passes in a variable called new prop. And this is the next prop that can be displayed, that has been passed in. So at this point, this is before everything's been applied. So I can still access this.props.value, and it will be the old value. But new prop will be the new value for props. So new prop.value will be the new value. So I can compare the old value to the new value. Cool. Any questions with that? Fantastic. Okay, the next thing that triggers is a function called shouldComponentUpdate. ShouldComponentUpdate must return a Boolean value. And this will tell React, should I re-render this component? Should I update it based on the new information I've been provided? So the properties that you have available in this one is new props and new state. So once again, the same thing as the last one, component will receive props. This one triggers before the new props or the new state gets applied. So you can still access things through something like this.props.id, that's the old ID, and newprops.id. Newprops.id would be the new one. So in this one, I am returning a Boolean value that says, no, you shouldn't update that given the ID is exactly the same. So this one would return false if the ID were the same. So this one must return a Boolean, and you have all the information available to you. Any questions on that? Awesome. Next thing, component will update. This is almost the exact same thing as component will mount, but now we have more things available to us. We also have new props, new state. Pretty much anything that you need to have happen before this component runs its render function and actually is displayed on the web page can be happened here. Here I'm just logging out all of the new information, but you can be creative with the way that you're structuring your components. Cool. Then, of course, just like last time, it triggers the render function. And the render function will go ahead and just render it out with the new state or the new props, because the state and props are the things that are getting updated. Awesome. Any questions on those two? Yeah. So, after that, just like on mounting, we have a component did update. It's something that triggers after everything's been rendered, and that's pretty cool. So this one follows relatively the same life cycle. The next thing that we can, anything about updating? Any questions about updating? Awesome. So next, let's talk about the things for unmounting. And there's one function that gets triggered on unmounting. Component will unmount. And this one is just like component will update, component will mount, and it just triggers before this is unmounted. So if there's anything that you need to have done before it's unmounted, this is the time to trigger it. And of course, there's no component did unmount, because if it has already unmounted, that means the component has been destroyed, so really you can't access a function for it. Yeah, awesome. Any questions on unmounting? So, there are three things in review. There are three things in a React component lifecycle: mounting, updating, and unmounting. And there are all of these functions available for you to handle each of them. And you can get this URL here is your best friend. I go to this URL all the time to reference everything. This will tell you all about all of these functions that I mentioned and what they do. So if you are forgetting the name of that function, then no problem. You can just go to this URL. And also, facebook.github.io/react/docs is where Facebook puts all the documentation for React. They've got some pretty good documentation. Some of it's not necessarily, I'm not sure if they've updated it yet, but when I looked at it, there were a few things that weren't up to date. Like there's a new concept in React called context that was implemented a bit ago. I haven't included that in the presentation because maybe we can talk about context later. It's it's pretty simple, but we can maybe talk about it later. But pretty much at this point, that's kind of all you need to know, really, to start programming some pretty awesome React applications. You've seen how powerful React is and how it provides a nice structure for your websites and how you don't need to have nearly as messy code as you have with something like jQuery, where you're constantly selecting elements and constantly updating them. Are there any questions on this presentation? I still have maybe like 10 minutes left. If not, I can go into some tips and tricks about React that I've found. Any questions in general? Fantastic. Cool, let's talk about some tips and tricks then. So here I have my React element. Here I have the JS Fiddle. One thing that you might ask is, how do I do conditionals? Like, let's say I have a prop in nested that's like show name is a prop, and it's a Boolean value, and I say true. I want show name to be true. Now this thing, this nested component here, could have a name thing inside of it, a name paragraph, name. Now, but I want to dynamically make this so that name doesn't show up when show name is false. So there are a few ways to do it, but I'm going to adhere to the React style guide and do it a certain way. You should define all of your conditionals for a React component before you actually start returning it. So I'm going to say if name, first I'm going to actually define a variable. Variable name is equal to just nothing. If this dot props dot name, then, and if you are at all unfamiliar with what I'm doing, actually, is this too big or too small? Should I enlarge it? Okay, so if this dot props dot name, then name is equal to, let's define this the React way, p name, oops, slash p, and then we're going to go ahead and now this is a variable that contains some HTML in it. So just like any variable, we can insert it as dynamic content, name, and if we go over here and run it, I did something. If this dot props dot name, name is equal to name, I insert name there. Sorry about this.
You said show name equal to the hello component.
Oh, show name. Okay, this dot props dot show name. Awesome, thanks. Yeah, there it is. And then if I turn show name to false, then it won't display. So that's how you can do some things with dynamically getting things to display and not. What if I have a big list of things that I want to display? That's something that happens a lot. Like if I have search results. So let's display a big list. Let's say I have an array of various values in here. And you could have gotten this array through any method. You'd probably store this array in state, but I'm just putting it inside the render function because I'm lazy. So I'll just say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we have an array. And remember from when I talked about JSON, this is how you define an array with these brackets, and you can just define it like that. Now I want to iterate through that array. I can do that using JavaScript's map method. So I have dynamic content. Let's create some dynamic content in here where I will say array.map. And who's familiar with functional programming and what map does? Okay, anyone want me to explain map? Okay, so map is a functional programming concept that is done on arrays, and map will take in each value. You pass in a function into map, and it will run that function, and then that function should return a value. All of those values that have been returned by that function will create a new array that is all of those returned values, and those returned values correspond to the original values that have been put in. So I say I'm going to perform a map on the array, and I'm going to have a function, and it's going to have a value. It's going to take in a value, and then I can just return regular JavaScript. Regular HTML. So span, and then we will put some dynamic content in this for value /span. Or let's make this a paragraph. just so it's easier to see. And I'm pretty sure that will work. Let's try it out. Okay, I did something wrong. Did I get all the brackets matched up? Array.map, function value, return value. Sorry. I shouldn't have to return an array. I'm looking up right now the callback. Callback has a current value index array. Yeah. So, sorry about this. First of all, when you run into a problem, you look at the. I'm using uncaught error, line 17, unexpected token. Line 17.
I think you have an extra parenthesis.
Where? Oh. No, that corresponds to the function. This should work. Okay, I'm going to do something. All right. Yeah, this is why I put most of the stuff into PowerPoint. And I'm going to look at my code. Object.keys.map function key return okay, it is a bracket problem. So array map oh no, wait, no, it's not a bracket problem, because in my code that closes the function, that closes that, and then that closes that. Perhaps, okay, wait. This might be it. Let's see. Yeah, that was it. Okay, so another lesson to learn in JavaScript, in React, is that oftentimes you'll have this problem that you run into where you'll try to list out a bunch of elements, but React wants an overall encompassing parent element. So here I had to surround it with div in order to get it to actually work properly. And if you don't want things to actually affect styling or something, you can make it a span. It just needs to be inside of this overarching parent element, which is actually one of the tips I had to say. So we just knocked out 2 tips.
Are you sure it's the div? I think maybe like you forgot to run it the last time you tried.
No, I think that, so let's just do an experiment. I'm pretty sure that,
No, you have to have a div here.
yeah, you do have to have the
Not
div.
div inside the span.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Oh, okay, I guess I thought that I was running it before. Okay. So there are other times, okay, so like that does apply for this div. So everything inside of a component must be in one nested element, but I guess it doesn't necessarily apply for this kind of repeating element. How much time is left?
You're good. You have like 10 minutes.
Okay, cool. So some other cool tips and tricks. Styling. Styling a React component works different from styling something else. So first of all, you remember when you had when you were doing HTML and you said class is my class, and if we had, let's just create a style tag here. Style. Oh, so for CSS, use the panel on the right. That's right. So let's you remember that we can have a class called my class and then have dot my class and say background color is red, or of course our favorite color, cyan. It needs to be cyan. So if I did that, then I would this thing that has nested would show up as cyan in the background color, but it doesn't. That's because React renames certain things. And in React, it's actually called class name. So instead of class, just to say class name, if we were to run this, you can see now it has a cyan background. Awesome. Other styling. So did we teach like attribute styling, like with the style tag?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So if you remember, when we did the style tag, you would list things out kind of the way that you list it in HTML. You could say background color is red, and that all works. But in React, React's obsessed with dynamic content. So you don't insert a string into style, you insert an object. So remember, JSON objects start out with these brackets. Our key is the actual name of the name of the attribute, and React renames these attributes a bit. So background color is not background dash color, it's background uppercase color. Usually these renamings are just if it had a dash in it before, it instead in uppercase. Just because that's the way JavaScript notation works, it doesn't like dashes unless you surround the key by quotation marks. So now we can say it's red. So background color is red. If we run it, oh yeah, I need the double brackets, right? Yeah. So once again, dynamic content. The first bracket represents the fact that this is dynamic content. The second bracket represents the fact that this is an object. So if we run it, now we can see the background's red. Cool. So that's how you might do styling.
Show an example of changing styling once the object is
Oh yeah, exactly. Cool. Let's make an example of changing styling when... Yeah, so we can make the style. So let's say if instead of show name, we'll say red. So if this dot props dot red, then var style is, we'll start it out, initialize it with an empty array, and say style is background color is red. Perfect. And keep in mind that you must define these styles in quotation marks because you are inserting string values. These all take in string values. And we can have an else statement where we'll make the background color cyan. And then, instead of this object here, we'll just insert style. And this style is the variable that corresponds with this style variable. So if we run it, style is that, style is that, style, style. Let's just click this multiple times to see if it's the same problem. R is undefined. Okay, I deleted array when I did that. Cool. So now it's cyan because red is false, But if I make it true, then I can run it, and now it is red. You can also do, instead of this, where you're defining this to style, so this is just the way that you would define it as, like, it's now a new object, but we can also define it as an attribute, .background color is equal to red. So that works too. Because this is just a part of the style is already an object, so we can just add a new attribute to that object, and it still works. Fantastic. Cool. So one other thing I can show you is form actions. So React handles form actions as well. Let's say I want to, let's get rid of nested, just for cleanliness. We're going to get rid of nested. I'm going to create a form. Did we go over forms? We didn't go over forms? Okay, so forms are pretty standard. They allow you to take in various input. Like if you've seen text box, radio button, and then like a submit at the bottom, that's a form. And a form is defined through the form tag. So let's just do input type equals text. And so that's text, and then ref is equal to text or name, sure. And then I'm going to create another input element. Type is equal to submit ref, or we don't need a ref for this one. So let's go through exactly what I've said here. So these two are input elements. So our form is going to, let's just render this to see what it looks like. So you can see it comes with a text box and then a submit button. Beautifully styled, may I note. Yeah, that's a beautifully styled form there. So what it's going to do is when I click this submit button, the form will submit. So what happens when the form submits? Well, we can use React's, so there is, oops, some mud, submit. On submit, React has a function called onSubmit that can link up with one of your functions. So this dot submit. And remember, when we create our own functions, we can define them up here. So submit is a function that takes in an E. So if you remember from jQuery, E is the actual element. So this submit thing will take in the element of the form. So let's just alert ew when we submit right now. We're going to run it. Oh yeah, I forgot the comma. Okay, awesome. So this isn't actually going to matter. We submit it. It says ew. But there's a problem that's happening. You can't see it, but okay, actually now you can see it because it says error, please post a request. So the default action in a web browser is to make a new request and reload the web page. Now React, if you remember from my previous, from one of my Lightning talks, I talked about the benefits of single page applications. React is designed to be a single page application. And we don't want it reloading the web page after we post something. So the way that we avoid that is by using our fancy little element that we've received, and we do e.prevent default, and that will prevent the default action from happening. So if we run this, type this in, submit, it says heyo, and we stay on the same web page because it didn't actually go to the new web page. So that's awesome. Now we have this value from the box, and we want to get it. So, okay, let's see if I can remember how to do this. This is search.js, resume, home. Oh, okay, so then let's try to get the value of this input type. You notice that I said ref here. Ref is an attribute used by React to help find the actual elements. So I can alert this .refs name, because that's the name of this attribute. .value, I believe. Let's see. Okay.
You can say this find DOM node and give it the
Is it? Oh yeah, React.find DOM node. That's right. And then .value at the end. Okay, so yeah, there's a few things. Actually, let's use this opportunity to look it up and show you the React documentation. Forms. So here's the React documentation. Really great. Facebook.com/. It contains examples. So we can see render text area. Okay, apparently this isn't the proper place to see that documentation. More about refs. Okay, here we go. Okay, so it's react.findDOM node, this.refs.myInput. Cool. As a web developer, you do a lot of searching on the web for things that you forgot about. And I believe it's .value, and then let's just do a .trim on that as well, because .trim will get rid of any any sort of outline, any leading or preceding spaces or anything that we don't want. So now let's run that and see how it happens. See what happens.
Can you change my inputs? No?
I didn't.
If I have the-
Oh yeah. Dot name. Yeah. Okay, so now you can see we've gotten the value of that, and with that you can do maybe an AJAX request or anything you want. Maybe set it as state. You can transfer that into state if you wanted to. Lots of awesome things because React is super powerful. Cool. So those are some of the tips and tricks that I was thinking that I could show you for working with React. So now you know how to do input. Now you know how to work with React components. Now you know how to do various conditional things in React. You know how to repeat things in React. You know the basics for all the functions that get triggered in React. You know how to do nested components, and you know how to handle state and props. Any final questions? Yeah.
You said like this has to get compiled.
JSX does. So if you notice here in my console, I'm getting all these warnings, like you are using in-browser JSX transformer. So Facebook is nice enough to provide a compiler for JSX that works both in browser or on the server. The one on the browser is slower and it's less efficient. That's why they have all of these alert messages or all these logs to tell you you shouldn't be using this for anything but development. So usually you'll have some kind of compiler or transformer on the server that will generate it will change all of your HTML elements into what React elements should look like. So JSX versus JS, you can kind of see what it will look like as a actual React element. Let's see. Nav blue. Okay. So this here.
You can try to zoom in a little bit.
Okay, yeah. So this here is what it looks like in JSX. So nav is not a new kind of element. It's default to HTML. So that one's pretty standard. So you can either define that element here, or what it will compile to is this React create element, and then it passes in nav, and it passes in its attributes, and it passes in It passes in a function to help create it. Or no, this is the child. So here's the child. So this profile function here is the child. So that's what it looks like when it gets compiled. That would be really annoying to type. So we just use JSX in order to do that. Fantastic. Cool. So, any other questions at all? So React is really awesome. Hope you start doing a lot of development with React. If you have any questions at all, you can email me. Let me get my notes up here in order to. You can email me at jacksoncreed@gmail.com. I apparently cannot zoom in on this. Okay, bad idea to use this as my notes. Text compare, thanks. Text compare is awesome. It gives you text boxes. And I can zoom in on this page. Woo, there we go. That's it. That's my email. Right there. So, yeah. Fantastic.
Awesome.